place to start when we're talking about grant is to understand the difference between direct and indirect funds. So if I said I have, when I brought in, when I'm trying to make my case for promotion, I say I brought in, some amount of money, $300,000 in indirect funds to the institution. What does that mean? What does indirect mean? If I know the answer. So when you write a grant, like you write a budget for the grant. So we just wrote a grant that has a $250,000 annual budget. That is money that you can then divide up into equipment, personnel, etc. Right? This is called the direct fund. That's the actual budget line. There's also something that doesn't appear in the budget line called indirect money. That is money paid by the NIH to your institution. There is a formula to calculate the amount of indirect funding that goes to the institution based on the amount of direct funding. And that is set per institution. I don't know what it is for UT. My estimate is it's about 0.4. So 40% of the cost of a grant to the NIH doesn't go to the investigators, it goes to the institution. The institution uses that money to pay for the stuff an institution does, the buildings, the secretaries, the lighting, whatever, right? And research, just like undergraduate universities, they use it to pay for things like the philosophy department, the English department, where all the non-grant earning departments, along with endowments and everything else. But that's what the indirect funds are used for. So in some places, they say, okay, well, if you bring in X amount of indirects, we'll start giving you some of this indirect back to you. So for example, our institution has a policy where if you get a second NIH grant, they give you like $10,000 back on the grant as a one-time thank you check, which is nice, but it's a small fraction of the actual amount of the indirect. So it's sort of a token, but whatever, at least there's a token. So who gives indirects? Well, the NIH always gives indirects. National Science Foundation gives indirects for most grants, as far as I know. DARPA gives indirects. Office of Naval Research gives indirects. I should write these down. So NIH, NSF, Office of Naval Research, / I'll put DOD, which includes Army, DARPA. Right? All of these give indirects. So when you write a grant, you say, oh, look, I got this grant. And one of the next questions that comes in will be, okay, where's it from? And if you say, well, it's from Epilepsy Foundation, they'll say, well, that's great, it helps. There's no indirects. No one cares. They do care, but not really. So these the smaller foundational grants are important to get your career started because it allows you to get data to write one of these grants. So that's why these are the currency of actually being a researcher. So people that have a career in research, these are the grants that you have to get. One of these. Among these, it doesn't really matter, but I'll get into why certain grants are more preferred than others over time. Okay, so that's the difference between direct and indirect. These are the agencies. There may be others. These are the main ones that I'm aware of that give this type of money. I'm not going to get into all the different nuances of NSF or DARPA grants. These are more, NSF is its own thing that I don't have as much experience with. Naval Research, DoD, and DARPA. This can be a lot of money, but the projects are usually very specific, and they usually go to people that are already pretty established, that they have a working relationship with in some capacity or another. So I'm going to set those aside and focus on NIH grants right now. Right, so focusing on NIH grants, the first breakdown is between training grants and just normal research grants. And then we'll do the final breakdown, which will be institutional grants, or programmatic grants, I should say. So the training grants are broken down. The first one, the canonical one that people write about is called an F-31, also called the Kirkstein. The F-31 is a grant given to graduate students who are pursuing training at an institution. The grant is written by the graduate student. There's a mentor statement, which is important. The way that training grants are scored in general is a little different than the way that research grants are scored, insofar as the quality of the training plan, the utility of the training plan, and the potential for the individual to become an independent investigator are included as review criteria. Whereas if you're writing a research grant, you're already, saying you're an investigator, so it's just about the other factors, right? So F31 is for graduate students. There is something called an F30, which is for pre-graduate, which basically means post-undergrad, pre-graduate. The bar for these is a little lower, but there's less money for it. So these do exist. And I'll get into some nuances with that later. But that's F31, and then there's F32. F32 is a postdoc grant. So it's the same thing. It's a 2-year grant. The research can take 3 years, but it'll only be funded for 2 years. And that's what you would write as a postdoc. If you are a medical or a resident who then is going into the lab, you said, I want to write an NIH grant that would pay for my time, this is the grant you would write for. As you'd predict, these are pretty competitive. And in my experience, I'm on a study section that reviews these grants, and the quality of the grants that come from neurosurgical applicants is usually not great. So I would say that it's a high bar for medical in general, but neurosurgery in particular, although not impossible. Certainly, you need to have 2 years carved out. It can't just be 1 year. It's got to be 2 full years of research time carved out, and to write for an F32. So then we'll move on to the next level of training grants, which would be a K99/R01. So a K99 grant is a grant you would write at the end of your time in postdoc, usually postdoc. I'm going to go into practice, or I'm practice, but I'm going to go into my research career, whatever that is, if it's medical practice too. And I've got another year, maybe got 2 years left in my postdoc, and I want to write for this. And the way the K99 works is there's 2 phases. I should say R00, not phase. Where there's the K99 phase and there's the R00 phase. The K99 phase means that you are being mentored. So you're with your research mentor where you're doing your postdoc. You say, here's aim 1. I'm going to get mentored in learning technique X or disease condition Y or whatever. And then the last 2 aims, or the last 1 aim, depending on how you write it, that is when I'm going to be independent. So that I'm going to move on to my job, I'm going to get a job, and I'm going to use this grant independent, not relying on my research mentor. There's a mentored phase and a career phase. So this is kind of a hybrid. It's evaluated to see if the research and training is useful, if it's actually needed. So if someone has published 5 papers in a given area in Nature, they're saying, well, I'm going to get more training in this same thing, then that's not quite right. They want to see that you're training in something new. So when you review these grants, the program officer from the NIH says, here are the ways that we should think about reviewing these grants. And the phrase that they use for K99s is, we're looking for the sure thing Ferrari, right? We're looking for an exceptional individual. You're buying a car. We know it's a Ferrari. It's definitely a Ferrari. It's going to go fast. It's whatever else you know about it. So they have they see these as, they want low risk candidates for these grants because it's 7-8 year commitment between the training phase and the independent phase. Because then the NIH says they'll fund you wherever you go for 5 years under an R00 phase. So these do come in from neurosurgical applicants here and there. For example, if you're going to do a fellowship, you could do a K99 mentored phase during the fellowship. Probably have to take a little bit longer time in the fellowship to make it plausible that you're doing clinical work plus fellowship, but people do that. Stanford does this for some certain people. Hard to get, but if you get it, when you go to apply for a job, you say, look, I've got this grant. It'll pay for me to get my lab off the ground for 5 years. It's like, that's pretty exceptional. So, but these are hard to get to. So then the other option is what's called a K23. So has anybody heard of a K23? So a K23 is a mentored grant. This is one you get when you're in your independent job. So you have your job now. You're not a postdoc or a resident anymore. You have your assistant professor or whatever. And you're going to write a mentored grant. The mentored grant has a mentor. That mentor has to be something different than what you have done before, a little bit, right? So if you want to, like for me, I study memory. So I got here, I wrote a mentored grant. And the mentor was an fMRI person known for like cognitive tasks. It wasn't really an electrophysiology, neurophysiology person like I had been in my postdoc time. So it was a little different, but not that different, you know, it's kind of that kind of thing. And then there's a training plan. Here's what my mentor is going to teach me. There's a training statement. Here's what my mentor has, you know, the mentor writes it and says, here's how I'm going to train this person. Here's all the conferences he's going to go to. Here's where he's going to, you know, publish his work. Here's the schedule for how the training is going to happen. It often includes formal coursework. Okay, like I'm going to go and take Stats 938 over at SMU, you know, whatever you need for formal coursework. It can include co-mentors, but it's evaluated mostly on the strength of the primary mentor. So just like for all these mentored grants, the training plan matters, the identity of the mentor matters. If I gave you any advice, if you're going to write one of these grants, pick a mentor who has had other students who went on to get independent jobs with R1 funding. That's if you don't find a mentor like that, you're starting with one strike against you at the review time. Now, there may be other positive factors that overcome that weakness, you know, that are practical limitations or whatever, but just be aware of that. Like if the mentor has not had other postdocs or students that went on to get independent jobs, then you need to make up for that maybe with a senior mentor, maybe some other strategy. Right? So K23. So K23 means that it is a clinical research grant, more or less. It could be like translational, but very translational, like the very last stage. This is basically grants that are going to go to the NIH and they're going to evaluate it based on, and it should be involved like, you know, humans, and it's something you would write for like, you know, doing clinical type research. You could write it for doing like a new trial, a new clinical trial could be written as part of the K23. Like a pilot clinical trial for a new device or something, right? So the one that I wrote that was called the K08, this is a mentored research grant for like translational researchers. This is kind of the most common one for people that are clinicians who do science. It would be a K08. Same idea though, the mentorship, all that stuff still applies. The last one is the K99. The K99 is just like what I said here. You can write it in your postdoc. You can write it when you're a junior faculty. If you're, you know, the same idea. You have a mentor for a couple of years and then you transition to independence. You can also do that as your when you're a junior faculty. That one transitions to an R1. The difference, though, is that most of these grants have a 75% time requirement. 75% of your time is dedicated towards research if you're doing it. There is an exception for surgeons where it can be 50%. And that's what we all say, you know. The K99, as far as I know, does not have that exception. It has to be 75%. So it's pretty rare for surgeons to write a K99 because of that requirement, where the K08 doesn't apply. All right. So these are the training grants. The training grants, next thing I should really go into talk about are the different institutes, right? So I don't have off the top of my head a comprehensive list of the institutes. But when you're applying for a grant, it's going to be when it goes to the NIH, it doesn't go to one NIH board, it goes to an institute. So I write grants that go to NINDS, National Institute of Neurological Diseases, stroke. All right. You could write a grant that goes to NIA, National Institute of Aging. They suppose they have a lot of money. I've written grants there. It can go to NIMH, National Institutes of Mental Health, National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease. There's others. There's ones that are for like skeletal, or the one I remember the acronym for the skeletal muscle one, where you might write a spine grant, you know, that kind of thing. But the point that I'm trying to make is that when you're applying for a grant, you have to pick which institute it's going to, and that should probably depend on where if you're writing a mentor grant, where the mentor sends his grants. But you know, then there's the cancer one, National Cancer Institute, NCI. But obviously, if you're doing tumor research, you go there. But you have to decide which one you want to send it to, right? When you're going to put in a grant, you have to figure out what the grant deadline is, right? And that will be slightly different for these different institutes. When you say, like, you Google NINDS K08 or something, what you end up having to read is the RFA, which is the Research Funding Announcement. When you submit a grant, you have to specify which RFA you're submitting to. These grants have kind of RFAs that kind of stay the same number. It's like a 5-digit number that stays the same over a number of years. But when you're looking at it, that's what the RFA means. This is what the NIH says the grant should include, is about, or should include in it, or whatever, you know. When you, after you decide which, for these mentoring grants, they go to the institute. It's the same across all the, if you decide NIDS, all these grants pretty much go to the institute as a body, Okay. But you have to decide which one you're going to send it to. One of the first things you have to answer. I forgot to mention one because it's kind of a, kid brother, called the K-12. This is a neurosurgery only translational grant or funding. It was less money. Now I think it's up to $100,000 for 2 years. It's like pilot funding, NIH funded, includes indirects. It's NIH funded through like a parent grant to like a consortium of like neurosurgical bigwigs. Like Iskander, wherever he is now, but where it used to be at Mass General was the one who wrote it before, and now it's administered by Dr. Ziffel from WashU. But this is available as it's from neurosurgery. It includes like some neurosurgical mentorship, like general kind of career advice. There's some meetings. Akash may have had one of these. I don't remember. He had a K. He didn't have a K-12. I remember I think he wrote a K-12. I don't remember. Anyway, so people who are doing is they often write the K-12 because, but you have to write it in your first year. If you get past your first year, you're no longer eligible for a K-12. They'll make exceptions, but it's kind of weird. So you have to, when you get the job, immediately you have to start writing the grant. Yeah.
Does the KO8 have a limit like that? You have to do it within a certain number of years.
Yeah. So you have to be a junior faculty, and you can't be an associate professor. You have to be at assistant professor level. It doesn't have to be your first job. In order to qualify for a KO8, you cannot have gotten an R1. I'll get to that in a second. But you cannot have had a previous higher level NIH grant and then go back. There is another one that is not always funded every year. That was called the KO3. That was a smaller grant. That's like, I used to do X, now I'm going to do Y. I used to study cancer, now I want to study cognition. I'm changing my career. It's a career change grant. I don't have as much experience with these. I've reviewed a couple. I don't know if the RFA exists every year or not. I'd have to look into it, but it is another option. It's a shorter term grant. It's meant as like pilot data for this career transition. I think Owicho had one of these when he was here. It was like I used to study X and now I'm studying Y. That's another option. So you're thinking about applying for a grant. We'll say that you're a junior faculty. You decide which institute you want to write for, right? If you're writing a training grant, it goes into the institute as a bucket. I'll come back to the different institutes in a second when I talk about the research grants. Okay, so the research grants, the first big one is called an R21. An R21 is a 2-year grant. It's a maximum of $250,000 per year. And it pays indirects, right? The funding amount is, pretty much the standard, but it's a 2-year grant. When you talk about percent effort, it can be whatever you want. You can put yourself down for a minimum. I think in order to be the PI, you have to put down a minimum of 7% effort on the grant. So it doesn't require that you have 50% time or anything like that. I'll give you my thoughts on protected time in a minute, but this is what an R21 is. An R21 is considered a pilot grant. When you decide how competitive a grant is, what you're asking is what's the pay line. So I'll go through the scoring for all the grants after I get through, but generally these are considered a little more competitive because you technically don't need any published or pilot data to write the grant, right? You don't need to, when you write the grant, you don't need to have something already on the books to show what your results are related in the same, related to the grant question. So that lowers the bar, so then it's easier for people to write them. And I think that's probably why the pay line's a little lower. There's just more grants chasing the money. The big grant that everybody, that's like the core of research is the R1. The R1 is a 5-year grant. It's around $250K a year, although it's a little bit fungible. You can go over budget, but it gets negotiated, or you have to talk to the NIH about it if you go over. It's kind of a negative if you go over budget, you don't want to. But that's the main one that everyone wants. It's 500, 5-year grant, $250K a year for 5 years. all of these grants have something called a no-cost extension, which means it's technically a 6-year grant, but they don't pay you anything in the 6th year. It's really a 5-year grant, but you can still say you have the grant when you're in year 6, and you can apply for renewal. So why does everybody want an R01? Well, because an R01 is renewable. And R21 is not. Renewable means that you publish some papers and you write a renewal for the grant, which is usually easier to get than the initial R01. Okay. And so by having a renewable grant, it means that now you have a lab, you pay the same people, you can count on the money, your institution can count on the money. So really, when people ask, like, what does it mean to be an independent investigator? The answer is, I had an R01 and I got it renewed. And then if you hit the point of getting the grant renewed, that means, okay, now you're really probably established in the career. And so everybody here at UT who's a professor, attains on the basic science side, if they attain tenure, generally that means R01, and either it already had been renewed or it would be shortly, based on the, how the quality of the publications that came out of it. So this gets back to Jeff's question. You can write a mentored grant if you've had an R21, but not an R01. You can be on an R01 as a consultant, but you can't be the principal investigator on the R01 to write for one of these mentored grants. Maybe a bit of a gray zone. Some reviewers might be confused on that point. So I probably wouldn't recommend it if you're planning to write a K08 and then someone wants you to act as a consultant on an R01 or something like that. Unless you really have to, you might think twice about it, because if it's not going to make much difference for your career, stuff like that. That's why everybody wants these. But you can have an R21. So you can have your own R21 as a PI and then still write a K08. That's what I did. But that is okay. For an R01, they have something called an early stage investigator, or IED, or early
ESI.
ESI, yeah. Early stage investigator status. So early stage investigator means that you're within, I think it's 5 years, you're still an assistant professor level. You have not previously had an R01, but it's okay to have an R21, same as the rules for the KOA. The early stage investigator basically just means they give you a bonus on your score. So it's like if your score was like a 95% or an 80%, they bump it up by a certain number of points. That varies year by year, but it makes it easier to get the grant. And that is why getting the R01 renewed, or getting the second R01, or getting some grant that's an NIH grant after you've had your first R01 is really the marker of someone who's actually doing research. Like, that's going to be sustainable, because it means that you've gone past the ESI status, you've gone past when you get the bonus, and now you're getting like just a general competitive grant. So when you start for your first R01, you will have ESI status. I've seen a couple grants now that come via this other kind of parallel mechanism called a Cohen grant. You heard of these, Dr. Plunkett? You heard some people over these? So I've seen a couple of called Cohen grants. A Cohen grant is an R01 under a specific mechanism where it's kind of like that KO3, where you're changing your career. So, but it's written with a mentor, but it's a normal R01. So it's kind of a mix of these different factors, So the ones I've seen have been like a surgeon, did some lab work, got a job, their clinical role doesn't, they're not doing tumor anymore, now they're doing spine. And since they moved into spine, they need to get a new mentor and write a grant. But instead of writing like a KO8 mentor type grant, they wrote this other thing called a Cohen. So it's a very sui generis, there's not as much money in it, but if you kind of had the right mix of things, it might be an option. But it's called a Cohen R01. That's how I've seen it called. Has its own study section, it's its own thing. All right, so that's why. So then when you look at like U.S. News World Report, department ranking, stuff like that. So on the one hand, you could say, well, we have 10 investigators with NIH funding, right? Let's say. The real question you have to ask is, in how many of those is the person who's in the department the principal investigator for the grant, right? On a grant, you have the principal investigator, the guy that's the main person on the grant. You can have co-investigators, you can have consultants. So the principal investigator, the grant is submitted to the NIH from his or her department. And that means that the indirects are credited to that department. You can have subcontracts. The subcontract would have to go, is if you have another institution. So I just wrote a grant that includes an electrical engineer from SMU. And so we have a subcontract written out for $10,000 a year in salary support for this engineer. There's a subcontract, that subcontract pays indirects. That means that the institution, UT, gets the money and then pays out the guy's salary plus indirects on top of it, which then goes to SMU or whatever. Okay. So subcontracts are it's money for your institution and the department. But when you look at how much NIH funding does SMU versus UT Southwestern have, the entire grant shows up on the ledger as UT Southwestern if it's paid out under a subcontract, right? And that's why being the consultant or the co-investigator on a grant doesn't mean the same thing to the department chair / dean or whomever else is evaluating you as when you're the principal investigator, right? So if you have the goal of being the principal investigator, you have to be careful about getting wrapped into all these co-investigator awards, because then the stuff that you may or may not be doing doesn't really help you as much in your career, and it can kind of take away some of the data or the time that you would have available for research. But what you want is to be an R1 or something like an R1 as the PI or the principal investigator for the reasons that I mentioned. Okay, so you're deciding to submit one of these grants, R21, R1. Let's say you want to submit to NINDS because you think that's what fits with the grant. Within NINDS, you have to decide which study section you think the grant will go to. This isn't totally up to you. The program officers from the NIH look at it and decide which study section it goes to. A study section is just code for what kind of background will the people that are evaluating my grant have, right? So there's one study section that I always submit to, I don't know what the new acronym is, used to be called LMN or Learning and Memory. So Learning and Memory, or LNM. Learning and Memory is a lot of people that do hippocampal physiology, stuff like that, right? So that you just kind of have to know via reading or asking people which study section matches your stuff. There's one grant that's called ANI, so Acute Neurological Injury and Epilepsy. So that's the one that gets I don't know, I guess it'd be TBI grants, but also epilepsy grants. This is more clinicians, people that do seizure models of rats or stuff like that might submit to ANI. This is just an example. I don't even know all the different study sections, but when you're submitting a grant like this, you have to figure out which study section do I want the grant to go to. It doesn't really apply for these. These just go to the institute, not really the study section. They often break them down a little bit, but it's not there's only a couple, So I'm on NST2 study section. That means F31, F32, K99, some not really KO8s. Some of these KO3s, and those are a grab bag. You get all kinds of different grants, but including some from clinician scientists, but many from just cases. All right, so that is talking about the institute. So then the last thing I'll talk about is some other kind of parallel funding mechanisms through the NIH. So the big one is the BRAIN initiative. So the BRAIN initiative throws off all kinds of different types of grants, right? One of the ones that many investigators are funded on via BRAIN is called a UH3. This is a team science grant, usually multi-institutional, with some kind of coherent plan. Multiple PIs on the grant, typically, multiple people that are credited as PI. Some examples include the study that Nader is on with Samir Sheth, that's about the depression thing. That's a UH3 team grant. There's the cousins of UH3 called U01, also considered multi-site team grant, but a little smaller, and I think it doesn't have the same technology component. I don't know. But same idea. These are team grants. The thing about the BRAIN Institute is that the RFAs are very, very specific. Whereas the R01, our general RFA you apply to for NINDS, for example, is just like an R01 grant of any topic or whatever. For the Brain Institute, the RFAs are very specific. We want to see molecular biophysical modeling, of neurons or something. That was one that came out recently. We want to see new devices to treat degenerative brain disease, whatever. I have it was an R01, a Brain R01, but so a single institution grant, but it was for an RFA that just got reviewed, hopefully get funded, that was related to mechanisms of brain stimulation. So it could be tissue, it could be whatever. We wrote a grant related to gene expression changes by brain stimulation of Dr. Kanopka. But the idea is the RFA was pretty specific, And so a lot there's the Brain Initiative has its own kind of set of funding separate from the institutes. And it's really been a total boon to neurosurgery research. Like there's a lot of people that have their grants via Brain Initiative that probably wouldn't have gotten them via the normal funding mechanisms. So that's awesome. And getting a brain grant counts. It's important, or it has indirects. You're the PI. All that's there's no negatives except for one, which is it's not renewable. So you can't go back and renew these Brain Initiative grants. The RFA may come back that it's like similar, but it's not renewable. So a lot of times the RFAs are so specific. Sometimes you kind of think like who they're kind of writing the grant. But that's more just sort of speculation. Brain does throw up R21s. There's all kinds of different RFAs. So if I was starting out and I wasn't writing a K08, I would look at all the Brain RFAs and see if I had something that matched exactly one. Because if your stuff matches exactly what they want, then you're automatically competitive for the grant. And just kind of anecdotally, having written brain grants and seen a couple, the standards for these are a little lower. Meaning for an R01 to a normal NINDS, you have the data, you basically are about to publish it in PNAS or something, you know what I mean? Like the data's there, it's like very set, clear hypotheses, one after the other. The brain grants are more like, we've got this awesome team, we've got this cool idea, look what it's a little bit more, not quite as sciencey. Not to say that good science doesn't come out of it, but I'm just saying the standards for the grant are a little more. So it's maybe a better opportunity. So the other thing that you might say is called a UG3. These don't have to, these funding mechanisms aren't only brain, but the ones that'll probably most apply to a neurosurgeon are through brain. So like a UH3, UG3, these exist in other RFAs outside of brain, but you'll see them. I think these are the ones that'll be most applicable to your careers. Okay. The UG3 is a small business partnership grant. So it's a grant that's like this guy in academics plus this company are partnering together to develop a device, right? And these get reviewed usually in conjunction with some UH3s. The Brain RFA throws off some of these, as a mechanism. We applied for one with like the brain stimulation for memory enhancement. They're reviewed. The panel members, I was on a study section of this very early in my career, and the panel includes a lot of like, do they have the right manufacturing for FDA credential, stuff like that. It's pretty nitty gritty about, is the device going to be able to come to market? So, but it's another one to look for if you see it, especially in a brain RFA. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about are program grants. What's anything else I want to say about brain? Yeah, so brain, the other thing about brain grants generally is that you submit it. I forgot to say this earlier. For all of these grants, R01, K08, F31, the way it works is that you submit the grant, it gets a score. How is the grant scored? Technically, there's 5 criteria. There's the approach, which is the science. There's the institution or environments is actually the word. There is the investigator, the individual. And for translational grants, it'll include one called mentorship team or whatever,
Significance.
I'm sorry?
Significance.
Oh yeah, significance, that's the thing. Okay. Significance and innovation. So significance is like, is this going to matter ultimately in the field of science or for human disease? Innovation is the stuff new, approach, investigator, institution. In my experience, it's pretty rare the investigator doesn't get a good score because like everybody that applies for these is pretty accomplished. And I think, certainly me as a reviewer, I'm like, I don't want to impugn the, the like integrity or the quality of this nice person who spent all this time in the grant. So most of the stuff that drives the score is here, significance, innovation, approach, as you would imagine. And I can rarely think of an example where I get like marked down significantly the institution from which the grant came. Partly that's because half the grants come from Harvard, but partly because like most of the places that send one in are, and UT is fine. UT, no one would look at an institution like UT and be like, well, I don't know, it's not like that. There may be some very specific instances where like, I'm doing MEG research and we don't have a MEG, but that's more about kind of the practical kind of execution of it. All right, so those are the scoring systems. So you get, the way it works is you come in, it's first reviewed by usually around 3 people who sit down and read the whole grant, pretty much every word you've written, should read every word you've written. And it takes me probably 2 to 3 hours per grant to like read everything and understand what they're saying. And you have to evaluate the statistical plan, stuff like that. And then 3 or so people do this. You get together. There's a meeting. Used to be in person, maybe it will be soon, but it's been on Zoom lately, where there's a lead person who's kind of pushing the discussion along for all the grants. Well, I'm sorry. First, these 3 people review the grant and give it a score. The score is from 1 to 10. 10 is bad, 1 is good. The program officer looks at all the scores for all the grants that are being reviewed by that study section, and they say, okay, here's our cutoff, whether you will be discussed or not. Okay. If your grant gets too high of a score because of bad scores, then when the grant report comes out, all you see is not discussed, meaning it didn't meet our cutoff for discussion. So then if you exceed that threshold to get discussed, then your grant is discussed. And then at that point, what happens is there's one, the reviewer number 1 is responsible for summarizing the grant to a body that consists of about 30 reviewers, but only 3 of these actually read the whole grant, right? And in detail. The first reviewer reads it, summarizes it, gives their opinion, and then explains why they gave it the score they did. And then reviewer 2 adds on to that, doesn't repeat everything. Then reviewer 3, adds on their 2 cents. Then the person who's running the meeting will kind of summarize the situation and ask for scores. And that means that everybody else in the meeting, all the other 30 reviewers, will then give it a score from 1 to 10. And then they take those scores, and that's how you get your final score. Final score is something between 1 and 100. And when you talk about the pay line, so then that score is converted to a percentile, meaning just in the normal way that percentiles happen. And when you ask what is the pay line for a given funding mechanism, what you mean is what percentile of grants are actually get funded in that mechanism at that institute. So a normal pay line at NINDS is like the 15th percentile, maybe 17th. It varies year by year how much money they have. So at NCI, it's maybe 9th percentile, 10th percentile. It doesn't always mean that it's harder to get them. It does mean it's harder to get them, but they may have more grants that come in. And so but it just tells you, like, once you've decided on one particular thing, what the pay line is. The Brain Institute grants don't give a pay line. They just give you a raw score, not a percentile score. And then via just the program officer kind of knowing how much money they have, they pick which grants they're going to put. There's more fungibility there than kind of the standard ones. They may say, well, we have enough money to cover this, but maybe we don't want to fund this one. Or they might get back to the investigator and say, like, well, your score was okay. You think you could improve it? There's more negotiation for the grants. So last thing I want to go over real quick is program grants, because that makes a difference for some of the things at different training programs, and then we'll be done. So program grants, the one that I'll start with is called an R25. And UT Southwestern had an R25. Caruso, I think, was funded on it. And it's being resubmitted now, as far as I know. An R25 is a grant that was invented by mainly NINDS, I think, to offer training for medical residents who are doing research. The way it works is that an institution applies for the R25. They get the R25. They're guaranteed one or two, usually one funding slot for a resident for that year. So that means every year the institution will have money to pay for the salary and I guess some research support for a resident for that year. The resident then goes into the lab funded, and the resident can write on his resume, I got an R25, or I was technically funded by an R25. There's also the option to have additional residents submit grants to get funded. So you have the way it works is that you have a funding slot. That doesn't mean only one resident at the institution can get funded. What it means is that only one resident is guaranteed funding, but you can submit 5. And then the NIH says, oh, okay, we read your 5. We want to give it to this guy. So there's and the other downside is because it's NINDS, they want all the neurological disciplines aggregated in this one mechanism. So our grant was joint with psychiatry and neurology. I think that's pretty typical. The one USC has one, and I think theirs is only neurosurgery, but I don't know that for sure. Yeah, but they have them too. But these are becoming more common. Yeah, WashU has one, I think. It's a pretty common way to get a year of research funded. It's technically competitive. It goes on your resume. It looks like you had funding for your research time. The other one is called a T32. This is a more general purpose training grant. Yeah, is it? What kind of research? So it doesn't matter. It depends on what lab you're working in. So if you're going to apply for R25 funding, you have to say, I'm working in this lab, I'm going to be doing this. The person in the lab that you're working in should probably be an R1 investigator if you're not guaranteed. But if you're the only one applying and you're guaranteed the funding, it doesn't matter where you're working as long as the plan sounds reasonable. A T32 is a more general purpose training grant. I was on a T32 at Penn. The T32 was administered by the department / a TBI guy. So I was on the T32. I had to report to the TBI guy, but I did research in a different lab. That's typical for a T32. It's really the institution is saying who they're going to train for a T32. These, according to the NINDS, these are kind of going out of favor for clinical departments, and there's kind of more so for research, like neuroscience departments, for example. But just because of how they are, there's some legacies where some still have these T32s and so. But this is essentially functions the same way as the R25. There's some guaranteed slots. There's some non-guaranteed slots. When you submit an application I'm not sure it's an R25, but for a T32 it is. If someone submits an application for funding on a T32, the institution has to say well, even if they don't get the NIH funding, we'll fund them for their research time, like a backup plan. There's something called a P30. A P30 is a program grant. Some of the money is actually for research and some is for training. So there's a possibility that there may be a training opportunity under a P30. So you can look for somebody to look for. It's another funding opportunity during training. Other program grants, there's one called an R35. That's the one I just applied for. And that's one that you have to have had 2 or more NIH grants, and then it kind of converts them into one grant, basically. But it's 8 years of funding and renewable, which is nice. So I applied for it because I don't want to be writing grants all the time anymore. That's the main ones for program grants. Oh, the last thing is diversity. So NIH grants, they have a totally separate parallel deal called a diversity supplement. A diversity supplement means that person X has an R01 and I, a diverse trainee, will apply, or the investigator applies, but the investigator says, I have this trainee, they're a diversity trainee. Everybody knows what I mean by diversity, right? There's a diversity trainee, and I am going to ask for additional money on my R01 to fund the training of this diversity person, right? And it's separate. It's like an add-on to the grant, but you have to have an R01 in order to get it. It's called a diversity supplement. The funding bar for this is pretty low now. Just maybe they're not popular, maybe there's a lot of money in it, whatever reason. Maybe that will probably change, but for the last couple of years, this has been a pretty favorable way to get people funded for training on existing grants. But you have to start with an R01. There's separate funding for F31s and F32s for diversity trainees. So you submit it as a grant that gets scored, but then there's a separate scoring criteria for diversity. That's an important thing. I'll leave it there. You guys have any other questions? Yeah, Jeff?
Like early professor grants, the NREF offers some. Is there any advantage to that? Or it seems like
Yeah.
you'd want to go to the NIH.
Yeah.
Is there a clear pathway?
There's also, I didn't get into it, but NSF has some funding that is, I don't have less experience with, but NSF offers, has a large number of early career grants. They jointly administer some of these F-31s, F-32s, but I'm just not as into the NSF side of, my research never fit quite as well. NSF has an early investigator kind of aggregate grant that's like a sort of like kind of a KOA, kind of a early stage R1. So NSF is great for that. The general question is, does the NREF help you? Well, it helps you apply for these other grants because it means, look, I've won competitive funding. It's given me some money to actually do some work, and that's good. So, when you're starting out, the answer, is it worth me applying for this grant? Well, if you don't have funding already, the answer is yes, it is worth you applying for the grant. But that's not a long-term plan. So that's why things like NREF and almost most of the institutional grants or foundational grants are usually early stage. There's exceptions. There's like Data Foundation. There's ones that are more like the equivalent of an R1 for established investigators. But a lot of the ones from foundations are meant to be, here's something to help you get some money, get some credibility, improve your application situation for when you apply for it. Yeah.
Hey, Brad, let me make comments real quick.
Please,
That was great, Brad. It was very comprehensive. I learned a lot. A couple of things I want to emphasize. One is in the scoring criteria he has there, approach and significance tend to drive most of it. And significance just means, is your proposal, your project significant for that disease? Even if it's a relatively rare disease, if it makes a difference, that's fine. The flip side of that is that so many stroke applications start out by saying stroke's a really good public health problem. Well, yeah, we know that, but are you going to make a difference in the need of that specific disease? And approach obviously is the meat of the grant. That's why it's always good to talk to other people about your significance and approach, because we're developing them, so it makes sense to someone else. The other thing that's useful when you're actually sitting in front of your computer putting this together is think about the end reader. Like Brad said, he only spent 2 to 3 hours per grant. I read a lot slower. My something I read. So I'd block out a couple weekends and you go over these in detail. And after a while, your eyes start glazing over. So you want to make it very reader friendly, because when you're in that room, as Brad said, that we would get. I've been on a couple of different study sections. One, you get over 100 applications and you thin them down. Obviously, someone will make the initial pay line, but you have 15 minutes. And the lead person has like 4 minutes to summarize it, a few follow on and just say, I agree or disagree. Then the statisticians weigh in. Then you open it up for general discussion. All the work you're doing is going to get digested in public or in a very short amount of time. So, be very clear in your writing. Another study section I was on was the opposite, where we'd only have a few grants to review, but these were the big clinical trial grants with multi-million-dollar budgets. So those, we would spend a lot of time kicking them around, getting really deep into the details. So that's really approaching significant.
Keith, you have a question?
Yes, for K99, the one postdoc track, and there was one as junior faculty. Is there any advantage or difference between those two?
Writing a K99 as a postdoc versus as a junior faculty?
Just, yeah.
So the answer is that if you get a K99 as a postdoc, then you have a very easy time finding a job, because you've already proven that you're doing research that is NIH fundable. So it would help you get your job. Does it help you in terms of your research career? Well, I guess, I don't know. I think for a clinician, it probably would be about the same, other than the initial job offer. So if you say, I have a K-9, I'm going to show up, it'll turn into an R1, I'm already NIH funded, then you can ask for probably more stuff in your package, and you take a job.
That fellowship would need to be 2 years. You can't do that for
It would need to be a minimum of 2 years, and it'd have to have a 50% research component as part of the fellowship. Yeah, it's not that easy a bar to clear, but I think it can be done. Scott?
Little outside the scope, I guess, but say you do everything, you write the grant, you get the grant. What does success look like to a committee that's going to review future grant applications for like
Yeah.
early training?
Yeah, so the short answer to that question is nature science, PNAS, nature communications or cell, or nature neuroscience or cell. In one paper or maybe two, but it should be 2 publications a year for an R1 or R21 level grant, or R01 than R21. The R21 is not renewed, so it doesn't really matter, but the R1 means 2 publications a year, at least 1 or 2 that are in one of the big journals.
We can talk a little bit about protected time and some of these grants,
Yeah.
and how that, especially if you have like a PhD.
Sure.
partner.
Yeah. Okay, I meant to get into that. All right. So the NIH has a salary cap. The salary cap is $189,000. So if I write in that I'm spending 50% of my time in research, the NIH takes that to mean $90,000 in salary support, right? So for people or for clinicians who earn more than $189,000, it means there's not a one-to-one trade-off between the money the NIH provides versus what you would bring in for that equivalent amount of salary support. My conclusion from that is to say the amount of money coming into the department relative to the big picture for salary support for like a surgeon is kind of trivial. You should reduce your % effort listed on the grant so that you have more money to actually do the research. But the people have different views on that. But that's how salary support works in the grant. The salary support for K9 KOA is even less than that, but it's not about actually supporting your salary. It's about getting the grant. You know what I mean? So that's number one. The question of like when you're looking at jobs, and yeah, people always ask, how much protected time will I have? So there's 3 ways to digest the concept of protected time. One is like if you have to physically be like, let's say the VA, like I'm at the VA, but I'm 50% protected or something like that. Well, at the VA, 50% means on Monday and Tuesday, I don't go to the VA, right? And half a Wednesday or something. That is pretty clear, or other kinds of things like, you must cover this clinic this certain day, you're in clinic. That's pretty easy to see what protected versus unprotected looks like. That's the exception. Most of the time, protected versus unprotected is about your productivity expectations, right? So if, I could declare myself 90% research right now, and they would still say, that's great, but, when are you gonna do all these surgeries? When you're writing the training grants, your plan, if you're a clinician, your plan for protected time has to be very clear, because reviewers, especially for surgeons, will be somewhat skeptical that you're actually going to be as protected as you're claiming to be, but it's not an instrumental problem. You just have to be clear on what it is, and you need support letters and everything like that, and the letter has to have certain kind of code words in it and everything. When you're actually like working in the world, when you're beyond the training stage, no one cares if you're protected or not. You declare how much time you're spending on the grant, right? And if I tell the NIH I'm spending 25% of my time on this grant, they don't care if I do it at, like 2 nights ago at midnight on Monday, or if I do it at, noon on Tuesday. It's just about, what kind of productivity you have. And so then by that, I mean, protected time just means what are you expected to do clinically? Meaning RVUs. So if I were applying for a job now and someone said, oh yeah, you'll be, 50% protected, I'd say, what's my RVU expectation? And the corollary to that is, what's my threshold for bonus, or at what threshold am I going to be like salary reduced because I'm not hitting the RVU expectation? Other questions? Alex, did you have any other additional points on this kind of stuff? I left out a lot of different programmatic grants that I'm just not familiar with. I didn't get into PCORI. We should probably have a dedicated lecture from someone that knows how to deal with PCORI. PCORI is the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. It's a separate, I don't even know it's NIH, it's a separate funding body that has its own grants, and they're the ones that fund like big data registries. They funded the the cervical laminectomy versus ACDF versus posterior cervical fusion trial. They were funded initially under Obamacare when that came out to like find actually cost-effective, quality, but high-quality treatments in general, and surgery included. I know my former co-resident Whitmore was partly funded on a PCORI, but I just don't know that much about it. So we should have a dedicated PCORI. I get a lot of emails from PCORI, assume they're still going on. Have you ever done a PCORI? All right.
Great, thank you.
Well, that was good.